This is the Sphere, worth 2.3 billion, and it cost the UFC 20 million to put an event on there.
The amount of Oscars, Emmys, Grammys, this will never, ever be replicated. Nobody will ever do this again. This will be one of the greatest things you've ever seen live, and we're going to try to pull off one of the greatest things you've ever seen on TV, too.
And you also said that you thought that maybe after people had seen this, that it would actually change the way that maybe some venues even build themselves.
Right.
Like, do you feel like maybe you still feel that way after watching it?
Do you?
Yeah,
I mean, there's no doubt about it.
It's been a few days since UFC 306 Noche has wrapped up in the Sphere, and I thought today I would go over if the Sphere was a success or if it was a failure for the UFC. There's plenty of things to go in, including did it live up to the hype? Was the card around it, good enough in the stakes that was set and the quality of the fights? And if I believe this was truly one of the best live sports events ever, like it was hyped up to be. The first thing that I would like to go over is just the Sphere as an atmosphere and how it was. So when it first started in Raul Rosas opening up the card, honestly it looked pretty bad. It looked very empty. There wasn't much scenery. It looked like a posh Apex, okay? It really didn't add that much. But as the card went on, you can't deny the displays and the animations and the effects were really cool. But the big question is, was it 20 million cool? Was it cool enough where we could accept getting a worse card? I don't think so. Obviously, the effects were amazing. The movie, I didn't really care about that much personally. I feel like most people didn't really care, but people could admit in the moment that it was cool, okay? But I think as UFC fans, we're just more bothered about having a good card. So there's genuinely no complaints about the Sphere itself, but I don't think people care as much as Dana, Hunter and the UFC would want them to care about it. Now, how good were the fights that took place? Overall, really good. Raul Rosas had a pretty boring fight, pretty boring display. But then, if you move on to the prelims, it started getting really good. We had Edgar Chairez versus Joshua Van, which on any other night would have been a clear fight of the night. You had Yasmin Uegri versus Ketelin Souza, a women's fight that ended in a knockout, you can't complain. Manuel Torres and Bahamondos knocked him out. And then we had a really good fight in the prelim headliner. Then you had Ronaldo Rodriguez versus Ode Osborne, which was another fight, which on any other given night would have been a clear fight of the night. You had possibly the fight of the year, definitely round of the year in the third round, with Daniel Zellhuber versus Esteban Ribovic. Brian Ortega and Diego Lopez showed up. But then, sadly, for the last two fights, which were the most important fights, they were both extremely boring and really put a damp display on the card overall. This was an issue with the Sphere. The card was really lacking in overall quality from top to bottom. The fights which had no stakes, which no UFC fans really cared about, and that had people that were only there for them being Mexican, those fights were great, but there was no stakes on the fights, and the fights that had stakes were extremely boring letdowns of fights and didn't go the way people really wanted them to. I don't think there's anyone in the world who wanted Merab to beat Sean O'Malley. And sadly, I do think this will make the card be remembered not very fondly overall, just because the last two fights really let it down in how fun the fights were and the results of the fights. Now obviously the Sphere had been hyped up for months. Do I think it lived up to the hype overall? While I do think it was cool, I don't think it lived up to the hype at all, really. I think from a sitting at home experience, the Sphere was cool but nothing special. I imagine it was insane if you were actually there though. And then when it comes to the actual fights, like I said, the names weren't there, the stakes weren't there, and a lot of the fights were just unimportant, which are not going to have any real impacts on how the UFC timeline or storylines are going to end up or go. Obviously, on the lead up to the fight, there's a lot of controversy with this fear. Now, the big question with this fear is, did the UFC beat Canelo? I mean, that's what the entire theme was made for being honest. It was just a ploy to beat Canelo. Now, we have no factual reports, but if we're just doing an educated guess, Canelo probably won. The UFC, in trying to get this fan base, accidentally alienated the fan base that they already have, which they have a big habit of doing recently. So while the Sphere was cool and almost a success, I think it was probably a financial, and I think for the hype it had, it was a failure.